go ahead and get started. As I said earlier, this morning is going to be focused on covering global climate change, something this group asked for and a topic that I'm really very interested in and I think is just critical for everybody to have a good background in. So we're pleased to have with us today Evan Lehmann. He's a reporter for Climate Wire. His primary mission is covering energy and the environment.
Politics mostly.
Okay, excellent.
Related to climate change.
Well, that's good because that's where we're going to open today, to talk about climate change in the U.S., the politics around it, maybe some ideas for generating local stories or stories specifically off your beat. And he'll be joined very shortly by Lisa Friedman, and we'll introduce her when she gets started. So, Evan, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thanks. So I'm Evan, and Climate Wire. Are you guys familiar with E&E at all? I know Blake is. So we have about 60 reporters in D.C. next to the Hill, and we cover Congress really thoroughly, and the agencies as well. There are several publications under the E&E banner, and Climate Wire is one of them, and that's who I work for. John Fielka is the editor, former environmental and energy reporter for Wall Street Journal for like 20 or 30 years or something like that. And he has a real emphasis on enterprise reporting and taking it nice and easy and really getting good writing and good reporting done, which is pretty nice. So I've been working for Climate Wire for about 5 years now. And that's where I'll start. Back then, that's when there was some action actually on the Hill on climate legislation. There hasn't been much since then. In 2009 is when the House voted narrowly, and I think it was something like 219 to 212 to pass cap and trade. And that was a June day, I remember vividly. And Darren Samuelson, our primary reporter who's now with Politico, and who spent something like 15 or 16 hours a day for several months tracking that legislation, celebrated with a steak and some hard liquor drinks right afterwards. And since then, there hasn't been any action at all, hardly. The following year...
Can you just take 1 second to
Sure.
briefly explain cap and trade?
Sure. Cap and trade is what they call an economy-wide climate policy. So essentially you put a price on every ton of carbon being emitted from utilities. Hey, Lisa. No problem. Being emitted from utilities and industry and things like that. So essentially you try to capture all of the big emitters in the economy. And therefore, by putting a price on carbon, you tell them to go find a different fuel source, like renewables or something else that doesn't emit and drive up climate change. So that was a bipartisan idea for a really long time, and I'll come back to that. When people like John McCain, there was zero sort of room between the position of John McCain in 2008 and Obama on that issue. Both of them wanted that kind of legislation. So after the House voted in 2009, the Senate, took its time and promptly dug in, almost a year later, when John Kerry and Joe Lieberman and a Republican, Lindsey Graham, introduced their own version of cap and trade, and it never got any kind of traction. Lindsey Graham pretty quickly bailed on the whole issue, which set the whole thing up for failure because at the time there were about 59 Democrats under the control, or Democrats had about 59 votes in the Senate. So they needed one, like Lindsey Graham, to get this off the ground, and it fell down hard. And I should note that it wasn't only Republicans who opposed it. There were a number of Democrats also who could never vote for cap and trade, and still are seen as a big sort of roadblock to economy-wide or aggressive climate legislation, because they come from coal-rich states and from states that would suffer financially from any kind of legislation like that. So then, onto the White House in 2008. Like I said, McCain and Obama were virtually identical. McCain did like nuclear energy a bit more than Obama, who wanted a really aggressive cap and trade program, but virtually the same idea, which is pretty phenomenal at that time. Obama fails and did fail for his first term. After cap and trade died, he introduced in his State of the Union address what's called a clean energy standard, which is sort of cap and trade light. It's not economy wide. It requires utilities to find some amount of their electricity, like 20%, from non-emitting sources. And Obama did include natural gas and in that realm, which was something new for Democrats. But that never got a hearing, or if it did get a hearing, it never got any substantial attention on the Hill, and that also failed. So 4 years of really frustrating progress for the Obama administration on climate legislation led him to his year of action, in his second term, and now he's pursuing, as the regulatory framework through the EPA, which is much less fun to cover in terms of from a reporter's perspective, because there's not a lot of politics involved. You don't have members of Congress sort of wheeling and dealing and leaking things and talking about it on the Hill and having fun with it. So there's that. And then, so in terms of trying to find climate stories in this period of silence and sort of a dry time legislatively, there are still federal policies that are climate related, and I think in an interesting way. So we'll sort of go through some of those.
I can't believe you did a PowerPoint.
Yeah,
oh
me
my God.
neither. If it wasn't for my wife, I never would have. Truly. So, I mean, climate change is really tough to cover from a reporter's perspective if you make it that way. I mean, if you try and tackle the whole thing at once, it's impossible, right? I mean, there's a dizzying number of Earth systems that are affected, affecting every element on the Earth, and thousands of scientific articles that add little bits and pieces to the climate puzzle. So it's really difficult to talk about it in broad brushstrokes. I think it's helpful to sort of dig down on some of the details. From a scientific perspective. For example, there's going to be less snow cover, for example, in some areas of the United States. And so what does that mean? For certain states, does it mean more drought? Does it mean more ecological degradation for salmon in the Northwest, for example? Does it mean water scarcity in Nevada? There's ways to sort of drill down on the science if that's your thing. If you like digging into that complex set of scientific articles, which can be interesting but time consuming. So I tend to like federal policy and the politics around it, because it brings in lawmakers' attitudes and sort of their ideas and puts them to the test. With legislation, some folks say, yeah, climate change is real, and we really need to do something about it, and then they go and vote for something that is completely contradictory to that statement. So that's why I love politics. But the Coastal Barrier Resources System is a piece of legislation that was implemented in 1982, and I know I put 0 acres up there, but it's really more than 3 million acres of coastal areas throughout the U.S. that is essentially cordoned off. The federal government has created maps in every state You can pull them up and see exactly where the barrier system begins, and the federal government says you can build there, but we're not going to give you any money for infrastructure like roads. If there's a disaster, we're not going to give you money for rebuilding or for beach nourishment, and we're not going to give you perhaps the biggest thing, which is federal flood insurance, which is a subsidized form of insurance that really helps economic development in these coastal areas. So it's voluntary, but the federal government waves a big stick, and it really works for the most part, but not everywhere. I went to North Topsail Beach, North Carolina, this fall, and it's one of those places where it didn't work, and it's a beautiful place. It's a coastal barrier island, about 10 miles long for the town. It's a longer beach than that, and they're building $1 million homes 60 feet in from high tide, which is sort of the standard, and which changes every year because there's pretty rapid erosion on that barrier island because they don't get federal funding for beach nourishment. So the erosion rate is tends to be higher there because they're not offsetting it, but yet they're still building a lot of homes all throughout there. And enter politics. Kay Hagan, the senator from North Carolina, Democrat, who believes in climate change and wants to do something about it, has introduced legislation to redraw the boundary in North Topsail Beach, and that would, suddenly, after after the town has built 275 houses since 2005, pretty rapid rate of construction, it would suddenly give that town the ability to ask the federal government for beach nourishment and federal flood insurance, which would surely be subsidized in that very dangerous area. So, it would add financial exposure to taxpayers, and it would also allow more economic development on that beach because there would suddenly be incentives to build even more there. Which is sort of interesting. So Congress is pressured by these towns, or by this town at least, to change the boundary, and I'm sure there are others there that should be found out and talked about because it's a really interesting story. And that is so that coastal barrier resources system is a climate adaptation piece of legislation from the 80s before there was concern about climate change. And flood insurance is something that you've all probably been bored to death by for the past year with Biggert Waters and then the repeal of that. I don't know if you guys follow that or not, but Congress passed. Are y'all sort of familiar with flood insurance is and how it works? Should I give a quick review? Okay, there's the federal government insures the riskiest homes that are already in the floodplain. So these are homes that are bound to have damage and losses from floods because they're all below sort of elevation standards that 100-year storm, which they describe as having a 1% annual chance of occurring, creating damage for those homes. So you start sort of below a normal elevation and then give those homes to the federal government and say insure them because private insurers generally won't because they're too risky and too expensive. And so this is the program has been troubled for a long time because they can't make money. They're $25 billion in debt after Katrina and Sandy, and don't collect enough premium, enough risk rate to actually pay for the damage that's caused. So there's that, and Congress thought for the first time to really address all those concerns in 2012 when they passed Biggert Waters, which essentially raised the rates. It raised the cost of flood insurance to what insurers would call actuarial rates. So homeowners would actually pay the amount of risk that they really face, meaning that the subsidies would be repealed. So they actually passed it, and they passed it. Both chambers passed it with huge margins. You know, there were probably a handful of lawmakers in both chambers that didn't vote for it, and then a year later they reversed it because they caught such hell from folks who like are suddenly getting these rate increases. So that was a climate adaptation story that I covered. I mean, that was one of the biggest probably climate pieces of legislation to pass through Congress and ever, maybe. Who knows? You know, I mean, you're sort of adapting to the changing climate and to sea level rise and things like that. And then so it was fun to cover because then they reversed themselves a year later, and so altogether they have $1.3 trillion. The government has $1.3 trillion in potential loss, which is significant. And experts call that maladaptation because subsidized insurance rates encourage development along areas that probably shouldn't be developed, like in coastal areas and coastal beach towns and thin islands that are constantly moving. So you know, for a long time, and people still say, obviously, that the federal government is actually making things worse as climate change, you know, is becoming more evident because you're putting more development in harm's way that you're going to eventually have to pay for, and you know, find ways to address, whether that's abandoning those areas, moving them out, so forth. And the riskiest of the risky are called repetitive loss properties, and these are areas that get flooded again and again, and they only make up about 1% of all of the covered properties in the federal flood insurance program, but they cause 30% of all the damage. So there's a tiny cluster of homes that you know that the federal government just can't figure out what to do with. And that was part of Biggert Waters was, you know, getting rid of those homes, raising the rates on those homes so that, you know, you stop encouraging more development in those areas, and also so that you can actually pay for those losses when they occur. And the number of those homes has almost doubled, or has almost doubled since 1995. And that's because the program's getting older, so you know, more homes are, you know, getting flooded repetitively. You know, it might take 10 years for a home to get flooded, but you know, over 30 years, you know, you'll eventually build up flood events on a certain home. So those homes are getting flooded more often, and sea level rise is rising, and there's just sort of less predictability in some of the flood events that happen because of more rain in some instances, and a variety of other sort of ecological reasons. So, and on top of that, FEMA, which oversees the National Flood Insurance Program, released a huge report recently that estimates that the national floodplain will grow by up to 45% over the next 60 years or so, due to sea level rise and other climatic impacts, and also increased development. That's a big reason why there's more damage from natural disasters, is because we're building more in places that are struck. So there's a real climate story to be told through those policies. One house, it's actually a church, a rundown little shanty church in Rio Linda, California. It flooded 6 times and collected $621,000 over 15 years or so. And the structure's worth less than $200,000, and over that period of 20 years they paid about $96,000 into the program. So that's just one example of sort of a property that sucks. So there's ways that the government is trying to adapt to this program to climate change, and just so that it doesn't go broke any more than it already has. And buyouts are something that it will do. If your home, this happened in Sandy, for example, if your home gets damage above 50% of its value, the government will consider actually paying you for that home and then tearing it down and leaving that area green space so it can be flooded and not incurring losses. It's it's a very difficult program because it's expensive and people are emotionally tied to their homes, even if they are wet, and it's also really complicated because you have to, coordinate the state and the locality and then the federal government, and do a bunch of paperwork. Yeah.
What states are the biggest, I guess, users of this
Wait,
flood
do you want to guess?
New Jersey?
No, but
Even after
Florida.
yeah, Florida and Louisiana are the biggest. They tend to be, the coastal states with the most amount of development on state and along the coast, and with the biggest risks of flooding. So New Jersey has a ton of development along, its risky barrier islands, but for whatever reason, it's just less prone to. I shouldn't say that. I was going to say less prone to flood, but I don't think that's right. For whatever reason, New Jersey just has a relatively small number of insurance policies with the National Flood Insurance Program, and it's probably tied to wealth. You don't have to have National Flood Insurance policy if your mortgage is not federally backed. So if you're loaded and you own a $2 million house and the house is paid off, you don't have to have flood insurance, and you might just decide not to get it for whatever reason.
Do people more likely have flood insurance if it's their primary home rather than like a vacation home? And I think another.
Yeah. Although I'm sort of guessing on that. And I think that might be a question that is related to wealth again. Because if you have a vacation home, you might just have enough money to, self-insure or, not have it be federally guaranteed, your mortgage. Yeah.
I will just say on the New Jersey side that was, I don't know how they compare, but I covered New Jersey delegation, so I heard all about this from them. So
Yeah.
they did make a really big deal about it. So it was enough of an impact there that the senators from New Jersey were really involved.
Oh yeah, I
On
mean,
the
Menendez led it, I mean, absolutely. I mean, New Jersey really got nailed badly, because they were recovering from, sort of a perfect storm, right? I mean, Biggert Waters coincides with Hurricane Sandy, and there are suddenly new sort of building requirements that have to be met, and higher insurance rates all at the same time as you're trying to fix your home or try to buy a new one. So yeah, I mean, it was a real big mess in New Jersey, and there still is. In fact, that leads me to my next slide. Thank you.
So it's a big mess in New Jersey
yeah.
of some sort.
Yeah. In Sayreville, I don't know if you're familiar with that. Sayreville is like a rough and tumble little town along some little river. I forgot the name of it. It's not that little. And so they came together. The town came together. I was actually up in the city hall when all these homeowners were sort of lining up at city hall trying to apply for buyouts through the federal flood insurance program because they wanted to leave. They were just done with it. These weren't homes that like on Mantoloking, New Jersey, where homes just disappeared during Sandy. These are little brick structures that were still standing, but had been flooded for like the second or third time in 8 or 10 years, and people just had enough of it, and they weren't worth that much, so they were hoping that the federal government would come in and buy their house because no one else would, and so the town got about 350 people together and are trying to spend about $500 million to buy out these homes to the federal government. I talked to some residents who said that like what were people doing building here in the first place? Why did I buy this house? I feel ripped off. I feel like that my house never should have been built here because the river's right there and it always comes up into my house, which makes a lot of sense. But it's buyouts, like I said, are really difficult, and one reason for that is because you have to cluster the buyouts. The federal government isn't interested in buying one home. They want to buy 350 homes. They want to clear an entire neighborhood in a floodplain of homes, so that they reduce their exposure to loss, and so that they can make that whole area, you know, a floodplain again that, you know, is free of any damage. And that's really hard to do. You know, I mean, I talked to some people in that neighborhood who weren't going to buy, you know, who were not going to sell their house to the federal government. And in this situation, they probably had enough to go through with it, but that can cause, you know, that can you know, blow up any type of sort of effort by a neighborhood or by 1 or 2 or 10 people to have their homes bought out. And then you also negotiate with the federal government for, you know, the home sale, which, you know, probably doesn't go very well. Not everybody wants to buy out. This is Union Beach, New Jersey, right down the road, 15 miles away from Sayreville, and it's right on the coast. This house was, you know, just wiped away from during Sandy. Union Beach had a 15-foot storm surge that rose on top of the high tide, and people were seeing within a half an hour or hour, you know, their homes just disappear, and they were jumping from their homes into the water. And one family I talked to tried to, you know, get on a door and try and boat their way through the storm surge, which isn't going to happen at night with, you know, 90-mile-an-hour winds, and their dog. And they swam for about 90 minutes and swimming over, you know, backyard fences and hitting all sorts of debris and losing the dog at one point. And they actually lived barely, and their dog did too. But this town, reporting tip, I always talk about dogs, you know. Not cats, but whatever. But Union Beach, you know, even though it sustained more damage, they didn't want the buyouts. They want to rebuild there, which is sort of interesting. It just, you know, sort of just creates an interesting juxtaposition between, you know, the mentality of towns and you know, that is spurred by sort of the wealth and the area. You know, this is right on the coast, a beautiful area, versus you know, Sayreville, which is, you know, sort of a rough and tumble town on a river. So what do they do? You know, well, they're going to have to do all these things and hope that it's enough.
Excuse me, Evan?
Yeah.
How much of this, the buying of homes is done under eminent domain, and how much, I mean, you mentioned some people want to sell, they're happy to have the government come in, and then they have a few holdouts. Does the government then institute legal proceedings against those few?
It's all voluntary.
It's all voluntary.
Under the buyout program through the National Flood Insurance Program. Which is nice, but makes it a challenge in terms of broader adaptation policy.
Has anybody proposed that maybe the federal government should use that? I mean, maybe it is impossible legally. I'm not a constitutional scholar.
I mean, I would love to hear lawmakers say that, because that'd be a great story. You know? Especially if it was a lawmaker from like Arizona who talks about buying out big strips of land, you know, along New Jersey or New Orleans. So no, I haven't heard that. You know, as we know, eminent domain is used for other purposes, but as far as I know, not climate policy. Although there's plenty of talk about abandoning coastlines and abandoning certain sections, you know, that you know, are high hazard zones. So you know, in terms of telling, or another potential story that, you know, you could tell are there are these new tools that are sort of coming out now. That show sea level rise, inundation in specific areas. NOAA has one, and Climate Central has one, and you can pinpoint streets, addresses, specific business buildings, government buildings, you know, police stations, and so forth, and actually see you know, predicted sea level rise up to 6 feet in those areas, and see how you know, certain coastal islands, for example, will disappear under that type of aggressive scenario. There are also less scenarios, you know, a foot rise over, you know, 20 or 30 years and things like that. They can also have significant impacts. So there's interesting ways to sort of get at this story from a local level. And and in Congress, you're all in Washington, so Congress is fun to talk about climate change with too. Um, um, uh, I spoke with Steve Scalise lately. He's from Louisiana. He's a conservative Republican, and he was working on an amendment against a carbon tax, which hasn't been offered formally, but Republicans have been trying to sort of offset any momentum on a carbon tax for a while now, because, in part because Republican economists like a carbon tax often, so they feel that a carbon tax might actually have some traction in broader tax reform legislation, which looks like it's fading quickly. So Scalise, was talking, about to me about climate change, and at one point said, that the Earth was warmer than it is now 10,000 years ago. So there were no cars then, there were no power plants then. So therefore, humans aren't contributing to climate change. And that was just a fun story to sort of dig into the science. I learned a lot about the science in terms of, why it was warm as now 10,000 years ago, and what was contributing to it, and taking to task, a Republican lawmaker who, clearly was sort of, at odds with the science too. So that's fun to do. EPA regs aren't as fun from my perspective. So some reporters, I think, would disagree with me. I think some reporters love the regulatory process.
Yeah, reporters should really dig into those.
Yeah, and you really do need to dig into those. But you can also localize those by talking to utilities and to anybody that might be impacted by those regulations, and they're going to have some strong opinions about them, probably. And campaigns are fun too, and this is partly because Democrats are beginning to identify climate deniers more often now. They're using that as as something that can activate their base, and so climate change is entering sort of the political campaign season again. Which makes it fun to follow, and maybe you can travel there and follow some campaigns, and in 2012, for example, all of Romney's economic advisors, including Glenn Hubbard and Greg Mankiw, who's really colorful, and Kevin Hassett from the American Enterprise Institute, all conservative guys, they all at one point supported a carbon tax, which it was a fun story to write, given that they were all advising Romney, on his economic plan, and at the time, and you could go back and you could go back and quote Greg Mankiw, for example, from Harvard, for saying that politicians all agree that a carbon tax is good to reduce emissions and generate economic growth to some extent because it raises a hell of a lot of revenue, and but they're never willing to admit it because of the political process. So it was timely to talk about that as he was advising Romney. So campaigns. So sometimes there's some good stuff going on in campaigns. You have to dig for it because it doesn't always come to the surface. And a word about deniers. Everybody loves to talk about deniers. When we write stories about skeptics and climate deniers, they're the most read every time for some reason, but you have to be careful because, groups like the Center for American Progress and Organizing for America, point out all of the deniers and they'll list them. I think they've got a running list now of like 135 climate deniers in the Republican Party. But you got to remember that they benefit from those lists, right? They're activating their crowd, they're activating their Democratic voters by claiming that Republicans are just way off on climate change. Some of whom are, but some of them aren't. I'd be surprised if there were really 135 members of Congress who deny the science behind the impact of greenhouse gases and that contribution to warming. It's basic science, and I don't think that most Republicans would venture to say that, because it would be, politically hurtful for them. So there's a wide arc of viewpoints. I'm currently working on a story of trying to talk to every member of the science committees in both chambers and ask them about the recent IPCC reports, and that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which released 2 recent reports, on findings about climate change and how it's happening now, and so forth. And I'm trying to talk to both parties in those science committees in both chambers, and you get a really diverse sort of response. Kelly Ayotte from New Hampshire, for example, believes that there's climate change. Dana Rohrabacher, a congressman from California, doesn't believe that greenhouse gases trap radiation in the atmosphere and cause warming, which is pretty astounding. So be careful about
He does
that.
believe that dinosaur farts caused climate change.
He believed dinosaur farts.
I'm not making that up. That's
Yeah.
that's a thing.
Yeah, that's a funny thing. And also, don't give Dems a free pass on this. Back to flood insurance. You've all probably seen Sheldon Whitehouse on the Senate floor weekly talking about climate change. You're all probably aware of Barbara Boxer's sort of heightened concern about climate change. Bernie Sanders, one of the most liberal members of the Senate, they all voted for legislation that reversed higher flood insurance rates. So they all voted for legislation that was maladaptive. It was minus adaptation policy, and those stories are good to write. You need to call lawmakers on their stands. Thank you.
So while Evan was talking, Lisa snuck in. Lisa, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Good. Well, maybe before you start talking, why don't we open the floor to questions for Evan? And then we can just kind of move on.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, why was it as hot 10,000 years ago?
Did anybody hear the question? Why was it hotter 10,000 years ago? I had the same question.
It was about the same temperatures now, and solar wobbles are one reason. As the Earth wobbles around, sunlight hits the Earth in different areas and causes a little more warming or a little less warming. Although a lot of scientists think that it's sort of just a wash because you're sort of just redistributing sunlight. But the main reason was CO2. And scientists don't know why. There were these burps of CO2, but there were, and they can find them in ice cores and other things, the temperature did rise over about a 10,000 year period, up to 10,000 years ago, by about 1 degree Celsius. So scientists, were highly skeptical of Scalise's statement because the Earth has achieved the same amount of warming, about 1 degree Celsius, or about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, over about the last 120 years. Which indicate that human emissions, according to these scientists, are having a much sort of more rapid impact on warming. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For the folks who say they don't believe in climate change, don't believe humans are affecting it, do you get the sense that that's a genuine belief, or a sense that they don't want to be pressed on the next step of being pushed to vote for some kind of carbon tax or something like that if they accept that humans are having an impact?
Yeah, that's a good question. The psychology of climate change is really interesting to me. I think you're right on both. I think it depends on the person. you know, I cover the Heartland Institute pretty closely from Chicago, and a libertarian think tank, you know, and their main mission is to dispute, you know, the science of climate change and the policies around it. And, you know, I really believe that Joe Bass, their president, just doesn't believe it. I really believe that, you know, he, you know, thinks that scientists are, you know, out to make a name for themselves and so forth. So you know, I think that he sees, you know, I think that he doesn't believe that the science is happening. You know, others, I think, to say it for, you know, political reasons. I was talking to Marco Rubio, for example, a couple weeks ago, and you know, I was asking him, you know, about the science of climate change, and he's like, why isn't the UN intervening in Libya or Syria? You know, I mean, he like totally just changed the subject, and so I asked again, and he's like, you know, then he turns to the policy of, you know, of climate change, and just wouldn't answer the question of whether he thinks that, you know, the science behind it is truthful. And to me, I think that means that, you know, he probably thinks it is, right? But, you know, why talk about it? That doesn't benefit him, because it does exactly what you said, leads to the next question about, you know, having to do something about it.
Can I chime in? So Showtime has this series now, Years of Living Dangerously, and it's different segments of both, you know, celebrities and others talking about climate change. And there's one segment with Michael Grimm, who has a whole other set of problems now, but in it, you know, I mean, Chris Hayes follows him for a year through, you know, working with his constituents after Sandy. And at one point he speaks with Bob Inglis, former congressman from South Carolina, who now runs, I can't remember his group, but he's pushing for a carbon tax and kind of runs a group that Evan talks to a lot that tries to kind of mobilize Republicans on climate change. And Inglis is talking to Bob Grimm about the science, right? And I mean, Inglis is talking to Michael Grimm about the science and saying, you know, why do we have such a problem with the science? We're Republicans, we should be, you know, we should be speaking on the science. And I mean, you know, I'm not, this isn't a, you know, the intimation from Grimm was exactly that, look, it's a slippery slope. You know, we haven't figured out how to acknowledge the science, but then talk about these very big concerns we have about how Democrats want to address it.
Yeah, I just thought I'd note, I work for the Kiplinger Letter, it's weekly business newsletter, and we had a whole lead about flood insurance, and we didn't want to say climate change because we knew that would anger some of our readers, so we said erratic weather.
Oh, that's interesting.
Erratic.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I'm back.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No problem.
I want to, my question is more about sort of when sort of the table sort of shifts sort of like less away from maybe, you know, Al Gore and like celebrating and like making people more aware of climate change. I recall watching a Frontline documentary, I think it was about the 2012 campaign or something, and how people kind of looked to the moment when Al Gore won the Nobel Prize, you know, about climate awareness, such a big issue, and how that was sort of like a key moment when people just were just like, well, if Al Gore's involved, he's an elitist, he's winning a Nobel Prize, and therefore all of these sort of deniers sort of came out of the woodwork and tried to kind of, you know, lobby against any kind of climate change legislation, and how like the gas industry got involved and would put out their own people to kind of counterbalance that. And I was wondering, I don't know if that was talked about before, but just if you're aware of that, and if you could kind of explain sort of.
You mean
if that makes.
If environmentalists have learned their lesson, and that got so extreme?
I'm just saying, my question is more about the fact, like, I was just sort of struck by the fact that, you know, you would think that if Al Gore is winning a Nobel Prize, that would make things easier and people would be more aware, and, you know, everybody would sort of understand, yes, this is a huge issue that needs to be addressed. When instead, what the film was positing was that it actually kind of made people on the other side of the issue even more, you know, incensed to sort of, you know, counter with their counterattacks against you know, any kind of movement or,
Yeah, I mean, you know, the
Very successful backlash.
yeah, oh yeah, and I mean the
I think he is the
institutions.
lightning rod, right?
Yeah, he's a lightning rod. I mean, the institutions that that some people find, highly credible. Like, the Nobel Academy or the UN's IPCC. Are not credible to other people. So it just doesn't carry that weight. And I don't know if I'm sort of getting at sort of what you were talking about or not.
well, I
but
guess I guess what I was sort of getting at was that before the Nobel Prize, like everybody was just like, oh wow, yes, climate change, yes, and inconvenience, yes, we're all on board. But then I guess people started picking holes in that, and then sort of compounding on sort of his success and using that as sort of reason to sort of discredit, which I found very strange because I would just like I personally don't think that that's necessarily reason to discredit somebody after you
I mean, I think that's a
I
compelling
don't-
story to tell. I don't think the
You
timeline
know?
is really accurate. I think that, well before Al Gore got involved, there was plenty of debate and divisiveness about how to address climate change. And I mean, maybe it kind of came to a pitch around the time that he won the Nobel Prize, also because that was around the time when measures to address it were getting real, right? I mean, you had, it was sort of the run-up to Copenhagen, which was a big climate circus that many of you probably saw, and we can get into that later, but, there was finally discussions about whether there was going to be legislation. So I don't know if I think maybe Al Gore, and maybe you have some other thoughts, maybe Al Gore provided sort of the easy enemy for people who oppose climate change and in an easy punching bag. But I don't think that he was the reason the issue turned.
I think that people were like using him, but like I said, I think I'm not making myself as clear as what.
Can I interject for a minute, because I think in mentioning an inconvenient truth, there was, how many of you saw the movie?
I think it was 8, right? When that came out.
I don't remember. But if you haven't seen the movie, you should definitely see it. I mean, it's a good grounding in this issue. The information is old now, but still, I'm sure most of it is quite accurate. So the thing that struck me about the movie was at the very end, after the credits, there were like these bullet points. Here's what you can do. Here are action steps you can take. Bullet, 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 bullet. I don't remember the specifics, but I can imagine people whose work, who are profiting from the status quo, could have looked at that and other things like that. This idea of climate change is real, and people are starting to see that it's real and that they need to take action. So people could look at that and say, "Oh, wait a minute! If people drive less, that's going to impact me. So now let me come back and start." I mean, obviously it's been going on for a long time, but that there may have been a sort of moment where the threatened interests suddenly ramped up.
And I think another point too was that there was a great piece on Marketplace the other week about how a lot of sort of big businesses and stuff try to whitewash their reputations through philanthropy, and one of the issues they raised was how sort of the oil and gas industry will contribute to a school and say, hey, do this big science department effort research on the environment, but I mean, when it's really actually
The greenwashing.
the greenwashing, exactly.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I guess it's not necessarily a question, it's more just like, well, when you have people like this, sort of like,
Color her frustrated.
yeah, I guess I don't know where to go, because it's like people don't want to actually admit to that, but in the frontline piece that I saw, there was a little bit of that, of sort of these like, oil, like these scientists were hired by the oil and gas industry that go out and sort of spiel their version of it because they're getting paid by the oil. So it's like, and they're the ones potentially funding campaigns, and it just makes me, like,
Well, you raise a really good point in terms of, how do environmentalists like Al Gore and Bill McKibben who are pushing Keystone actually help, the situation? I mean, are they expanding sort of the thought on climate change, or are they narrowing it? And I mean, I would argue that they don't really help very much. Yeah.
What, if any, are the climate change impacts of Keystone?
I don't, I think they're symbolic, right? I don't, this is something that another one of our reporters, Crystal Marshall, covers intensely. But from an emissions perspective, from a collection of emissions, I think it's relatively small over its life period, over its lifetime. The symbolism is that you're doubling down on oil for transportation. So, I think that's sort of the underlying message that McKibben wants, is that, we need to change the fuel we use to run about our towns and so forth. And if we put in this pipeline, we're investing in, Canadian crude that's, more emission intense than other crude for a long, long time. So, we debate in our office whether Keystone is a climate story and whether we should be covering it.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, coincidentally, I think,
All right, to speak up.
oh, sorry. I think we're going to have a post today that charts how much the carbon impact of Keystone in comparison to total emissions. So, read one for
All right.
Blake.
Is that me? Oh, right.
Mhm.
So, hello, fine colleagues. I had not a softball question, but hopefully a useful one. I was wondering, because so much of this comes from sort of incremental scientific changes that down the line might lead to more, political action or what have you. How do you stay plugged into, the scientific papers and the scientific community in order to gauge this maybe small changes now that might be more relevant and interesting kind of ahead of the curve down the line? What tools do you use to?
So part of this, because we cover, Climate Wire, we have 10 reporters covering climate change. It's very different than the way many of you would cover it. We take sections of things and dig deep. So, for example, on my beat covering international stuff, I probably read about 10 papers a week that I come across. I don't write about them, but I'm always sort of reading and keeping up with what's being said on sort of either the global emissions or global negotiations when it comes to flood insurance or we have a reporter who's a lead reporter on science who covers, I think would probably get more closely to your question, but on your stuff, how do you?
Do you have any suggestions for people who don't cover it on a daily basis? Is there a good blog they can follow, or someplace they can set up an alert?
This is the sort of the perfect introduction to assessment reports, which sort of boil down a whole bunch of scientific papers into sort of an analysis. And
which is coming out tomorrow.
The National Climate Assessment is coming out tomorrow. So there's your heads up. And in terms of more narrow science articles, if you get in touch with the associations from meteorology and every other scientific association, they'll hand you those scientific reports on embargo, so you'll have them before the day before that they're ready to be published in the journal. So you can talk to the author before that and have a story ready to go, usually, if that's your thing.
Two places to keep on your list. So Eureka Alerts, they put out scientific papers and You'd have to sign up with them, and they sort of make sure that you're a, real news organization. Papers come with embargoes. You'll get you can mark what you're interested in, if it's energy, environment, climate change, or if it's, brain development, or, child psychology. You'll get an alert twice a week about studies coming out, and you'll get embargoed versions. Also, PNAS, the National Academy of Sciences, also has a routine, listserv that you can get on, and those are where the bulk of the best studies. I mean, Eureka only puts out studies from peer-reviewed journals, as and PNAS is National Academy of Sciences, and their studies are reputable.
Other questions, John?
I just had a follow-up on the Keystone question. Are the environmental objections to that, are they strictly about emissions and more reliance on oil, or is there also just objections about the more oil, the more like you're going to have some kind of spill or accident or something along the lines of BP because you...
Big picture, I think, at least from the people that I speak to, like McKibben, he describes it every time I talk to him as sort of this rickety pier that, they're extending into, this sort of risky pool of water, and I struggle with the analogy too. But this the symbolism for sort of future, your future fuel use and things like that. I think is his sort of real emphasis. I'm sure there's local environmental organizations in Nebraska and elsewhere that are concerned about some ecological impacts from spills and stuff like that, and route changes through wetlands, and the whole gamut, I'm sure, is there. And if you were to read the State Department report, the environmental if you read the environmental impact statement for the project, you can fill your head with tons of those impacts. So
isn't there some question about the way that they're taking the oil out of the tar sands?
The oil sands in Canada is bitumen, so it's really gooey and tarry and sludgy, and you need to pump a lot of liquid into the ground, and the process for separating the oil from the sand requires a lot of energy. So that's where your increased emissions occur, is in the extraction and the processing of that stuff, because it's not crude that's just streaming up from the ground.
Okay. Well, why don't we do...
Sorry, quick question. Does the flood insurance program treat homes differently if they're primary or vacation homes?
It's a good question. In terms of rates, rates,
and whether they're more likely to be, involved in one of these group settlements.
Oh, in terms of the buyouts.
Yeah.
I think there are small differences, but not in sort of the big picture. If you have a home and you insure it, whether it's a secondary or primary home, you fall into the program. And I think for a buyout, they don't care, right? I mean, the federal government is exposed to that loss. So I would assume that that from the buyout perspective, it wouldn't matter. Under Biggert Waters, they did make a difference. Biggert Waters is the 2012 reform legislation that's now been re-reformed, and they did target second homes for faster rate increases. Mm-hmm. So you pay more for second homes right away, just because, out of sort of fairness, right? I mean, if you can afford a second home, well, you shouldn't be getting subsidized flood insurance. Is sort of how the supporters were describing it. So. So there are some differences, but I don't know to what extent.